So, given a decade of counterinsurgency operations, the Naguro-Karabakh conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and of course now the Russian-Ukrainian war, I think this is a good time, if there is a good time, but this is probably a time where we can talk about that thing that we popularly describe as drones. I'm going to be doing this in 3 chapters. First, I'm going to talk about the different types of drones that exist, what they can do and how they differ. And then I will talk about the reasons why I think they are, depending on what we talk about with drones operations, but why they might be a lot less useful than is sometimes said. And finally, I will talk about those scenarios where they are indeed very, very useful. To get it out of the way immediately, of course, the word drone stands for any unmanned vehicle, whether aerial or not, but it has become very much attached to things like MQ-1 Predator, MQ-9 Reaper, or of course DB-2 Bayraktar. Nevertheless, in this video, I'll try to limit the number of times I say that word because there are more specific and better terms we can use, as will also be explained throughout the video. This first part might at first feel like semantics, but I'm going to do this for a very good reason, a couple of good reasons. First, to get us all on the same page. Second, arguably the lack of clarity on this matter of definitions leads actually to quite a few misunderstandings of the different types of drones that exist and what they can do, and I want to avoid that. And third, I'll explain why I think we actually need to make those clear distinctions between some of the systems or some of the aerial vehicles out there, because within the distinctions we find the key to understanding their operational use and their capabilities. So where do we start with our definitions? Well, the first thing we can do is whip out NATO's AAP 06 Glossary in Terms and Definitions. And this is quite helpful, as unmanned aircraft systems differ from so-called remotely piloted systems in NATO terms due to the training emphasis on the operator in the latter. This is important because it frames the capabilities of these systems. I will go into the difference of a system versus an aircraft in just a minute. Now, before I go on, I know that some people might disagree on how I will be classifying this equipment. If it wasn't so, that would very much surprise me, because right now there is actually no universal standard. For example, the NATO classifications aren't really complete, and then if you look at countries even inside NATO, for example Britain, that by their own admission use the terms depending on if you're in the Army, Navy or in the Air Force or even in the Military Aviation Authority completely differently, it'll show that there is really no golden rule. But at the end of this video's first chapter, I will have provided the arguments of why I call a certain type of, well, drone a UAV, an RPA or a UCAV. Now, you might have noticed that these definitions talk about aircraft systems, whereas you might be more used to terms like unmanned aerial vehicle or unmanned combat aerial vehicle. First off, at least at the official level, NATO doesn't seem to use UCAV. Currently, it looks like an out-of-date term in official NATO lingo, although of course it is such an ubiquitous term that I don't see a reason why we shouldn't use it where appropriate. I'll get to that in just a second. However, the important distinction for now is that a UAS is a system, so not just the vehicle, but everything around it. So we're talking about 2 different things if we say UAV, which is just the vehicle, or UAS, which is the vehicle and everything that surrounds it to make it work. Now, I personally think that UAV is a better term than unmanned aircraft because in common sort of usage, the word aircraft implies something very specific, right? Whereas a UAV could be this small to a quadcopter to something more akin like this, right? So for the purposes of this video, I will continue using the term UAV because I'm talking about a very specific piece of equipment and not the system that surrounds it. But that said, I find RPA a lot better than RPV, exactly because of this specific implication that has to do with pilot training. A Reaper, let's say, is as much a light aircraft as is a Cessna, and requires broadly similar training, which makes that remotely piloted aircraft term a lot better. I understand that some might wonder why we need to make those distinctions. So here is my take on why it makes sense to use these definitions with a bit more rigor. It has to do with making a clear distinction between a set of vehicles that operate very differently. This is the same reason as to why we call a tank, an armored personnel carrier, an APC, and a self-propelled anti-aircraft gun, and SPAAG. And we don't just say tank to all of them, even though all three are broadly similar by the fact that they are most likely armored, have a gun, and they might be on tracks. These vehicles are vastly different, and their names already imply this. So really, we should also be distinguishing between UAVs, UCAVs, and RPAs. Of course, this breaks some conventions. For example, while the word drone is often used, the close second is UCAV. You see this being used from nearly everything, over a small armed quadcopter, over to Predators, Reapers, now Bayraktar, and even to Northrop Grumman's X-47. But these systems are very different in terms of capability and use. Predator, Reaper, and Bayraktar, they are remotely piloted aircraft, while the X-47 pushes that boundary because it uses semi-autonomous parameters. And that goes into what we should call UCAV. Here it is important to remember the difference between automation and autonomy as well. Something like Bayraktar is automated. That doesn't mean it makes decisions by itself, but rather it executes the operator's input automatically. Think of this like opening a garage door. You click on that little remote control and that sends a signal to, well, open sesame, and the door will do that automatically. It'll open up. It's the same for Bayraktar and control inputs for flight or for weapon release. It's that remote pilot link plus the training required that is the key in differentiating it from other vehicles like UAVs. The operator, although sitting in a virtual cockpit, flies something like Reaper, like a pilot would an aircraft. In fact, the first 2 to 4 months of training in the USAF, RPA operators get very similar to training to those getting light pilot licenses. So really it is an RPA and not a UCAV. And then something like the X-47 is different because autonomy is different. With an autonomous system, you assign parameters like fly over point X and collect meteorological data in all your sensors by yourself. As soon as you execute, it will take off, fly to point X, autonomously be avoiding areas that it has been programmed not to fly over, say military installations, and make its way to point X by its own route. And then it will collect the data it needs and it will return. Currently, a human still has oversight and override control and occasionally presses buttons to acknowledge the system's signals or adjusting its missions, but this has been minimized to the most essential decisions between the planning, operation, and execution phase of a mission, because you don't want that command link, as it makes it vulnerable. Something like X-47 works that way. It is semi-autonomous, whereas Bayraktar is automated, requiring constant control links. And it is this reason why something like X-47 as a concept, well, not necessarily Grumman's creation now in its current iteration, but as a concept, is something militaries are striving to develop for peer-to-peer conflicts, where RPAs, quite frankly, do not factor in as much. So to make it short, this is an RPA and this is a UCAV. It's an important distinction, and it really doesn't matter that only one of these terms has combat in it. This distinction still stands, and it has to be acknowledged and understood as these systems proliferate. I think this might also start making a bit more sense if we go at this a little bit more practically orientated. Looking at how these vehicles work and what they do allows us to make, well, a little bit more sense between the differentiation between UAV, UCAV, and RPAs. You can see a general breakdown given here. So as we can see here, you've got nano to microsystems that can fit in your hand. Then you can have a thing like a quadcopter, and then you can go over to your tactical reconnaissance systems. These are generally UAVs, and yes, that includes those flown by a very enthusiastically tinkering operator at the front line who sometimes straps a couple of firecrackers on his quadcopter. Just because it allows him to make something go boof doesn't make it into a UCAV. It is still a UAV. Just like loitering munitions are not UCAVs. Although footage of such small nuisance attacks spread like wildfire on the internet, the real use and value of UAVs lies in providing intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance data, not to throw a grenade. More on that later. Then we move on to the sort of systems you would associate with the word drone. So you have your mail, your hail and your sort of strike systems, right? But definition-wise, these are RPAs, not UCAVs. UCAVs are larger autonomous systems being tested right now, which are meant to provide unmanned, LO, and VLO capability in peer-to-peer confrontation. I already mentioned X-47, but of course the US is not the only one working on this right now. And these vehicles and the systems that surround these vehicles are very different in the way they work and the capabilities they have. So a stricter application of definitions like UAV, RPA and UCAV must be made. And it's also in our benefit because these definitions set out how they are operated and what they can do. We wouldn't call a truck with a gun a tank. So we also shouldn't call an RPA a UCAV. To sum this up, as a rule of thumb, right, we can say everything from sort of nano to tactical systems are UAVs, mail, hail and strike systems that need an operator who received comparable training to, let's say, a light pilot aircraft license, and thus these aircraft can be considered RPAs, so remotely piloted aircraft are exactly that. And then aerial vehicles with semi-autonomous capabilities designed for peer-to-peer confrontation, well, those are the actual UCAVs. Now, that done, I want to return to the RPAs, like for example Reaper or Bayraktar, for the second half of this video and talk a bit about the reputation that they got in the recent wars and recent conflicts, specifically of course between Armenia and Azerbaijan in the Naguro-Karabakh region, or of course between Russia and Ukraine. I think those conflicts show what RPAs can do, but also why it would be wrong to argue that they are now a new, supreme, game-changing weapon. If you go out and compare the more hyped writing on the internet or in the media about, well, what would then be called, of course, drone use in the Nagorno-Karabakh region or in the Russo-Ukrainian conflict, to the things that tend to be written by people in the field of defense studies and military aviation, you'll quickly realize that the latter are actually a lot more reserved about the future of RPAs than we might assume. It is generally acknowledged that these systems will play a role in future conflicts, but they are not the game changers that some proclaim. The reason for this is simple. For every weapon that changed the balance on the battlefield, a countermeasure has been developed. When you look at the industry developing related technology, you quickly notice that while the aerial systems are already out there, one very fast growing market is the countermeasure market, from small lasers over to handheld devices, or even trying to hack into a drone, an RPA even, or a UAV, because it has of course that command link, right, where that makes it vulnerable. And this is no surprise really, given the proliferation of UAVs and RPAs and what we have seen them do in the last in the last decade, let's say. And we even have these single incidents, like, do you remember when London Gatwick had to be shut down because of an alleged drone sighting? And that highlighted once again the potential danger that these vehicles potentially might have to something like commercial aviation, and how simple they are and why you need countermeasures. Of course, conventional manpads could already have been used and were already used against low-flying RPAs. It's just that you don't really hear about them that much, except for, of course, the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, where this came a little bit more to the forefront. But as we have seen also over Ukraine, you don't necessarily just need manpads, because RPAs and UCAVs, well, UCAVs in the future, but RPAs now, could potentially also avoid manpads by just flying higher. But you don't really need to develop additional countermeasures, because you can already rely on your general air defense systems that you have to provide that countermeasure against an RPA. Provided, of course, that they are used correctly, and that's the context there. The present success story and the hype surrounding so-called drones, which are RPAs, is largely based on the context of their use and what aspects we focus on. I will provide another 3 examples here. So coin operations, Nagoro-Karabakh of course, and the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. We have basically the same trends as to why RPAs worked so well, and that was that there were no countermeasures, or that the countermeasures that existed were poorly used. Of course, caveats apply over in Ukraine. I'm getting to that. During the early coin operations against insurgents, those Predators and Reapers were of course used to provide overwatch, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and of course also that strike capability that everybody talks about, although strike missions were actually rarer than is sometimes said. And also very low losses were incurred during this time by enemy action to American drones. Sorry, not American drones, American RPAs. While in 2014 it was announced that 38 Predators and Reapers had been lost in Afghanistan and Iraq, the reason for these losses were mainly system failures, weather conditions, operator error, and so on and so forth. In fact, losses to enemy action tend to be so rare that the only thing I found for now were some disputed claims in the lower single digits. And a very similar situation happened in the Naguro-Karabakh conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. While this conflict arguably created and cemented this idea of a paradigm shift towards RPAs as the end-all be-all in some circles, the success of systems like TB2 can once again be found in the context. We now know that Armenia fielded their frontline air defenses very poorly, and in the cases where this wasn't the case, they were out of date and unable to challenge Azerbaijani TB2s. While more capable air defense systems were deployed by Armenia later on in the conflict with some success, this came too late and with a very poor operational command. So to sum up, Azerbaijani TB2 strikes contributed less to winning the war than poorly managed Armenian air defenses did to losing it. And just to make this clear, I'm not disputing that RPAs don't have their uses and don't have a use in strike missions either, but those really must be seen in context. First off, against near-peer adversaries, RPAs tend to be much less effective, especially in the much-discussed strike role, if the enemy has a working air defense system. The Russian-Ukrainian war is the best recent example. While early on the failure of Russian air defenses to respond to Ukrainian Bayraktars quickly snowballed into very visual losses that were shared throughout the internet, thus hyping of course up that reputation Bayraktar already had. After the Russian air defenses had recovered, the success of Bayraktar as a strike platform has far diminished, to the point where Ukraine isn't really that interested in these systems anymore. Even if we account for the very innovative use of the Ukrainians using Bayraktars, for example, against Moscow as sort of a distraction asset, or in these long-range one-way strike missions that they allegedly carried out, these systems still show their limitations in the current situation. There's more information on that in this video right here. Russian air defenses right now outrange the effective weapon range of Bayraktar, making any flight into threat zones a very troubling affair. And these Russian air defenses have become more active than in the initial phase of this conflict. And yes, just because Bayraktar or any sort of drone, I don't want to limit this just against Bayraktar or any sort of RPA, just because it is smaller than a jet doesn't mean that an RPA doesn't pop up on radar. They pop up just fine, and yes, there is some evidence to suggest that Russian radar had some trouble picking them up at some point, but they can be targeted just as much as any other aircraft in the end. There is a general bias that exists towards making war a quantifiable affair, meaning that you look at it from the simplistic lens of loss numbers against loss numbers. Of course, losses are sadly the nature of war, and you cannot ignore those for many reasons. But what this causes, especially with the examples that I've given, is a focus on drawing conclusions out of what I would say a very limited number of very visual snapshots of these conflicts. Think about all that footage you saw from Russian equipment getting destroyed back in February and March by Bayraktars. You see a military vehicle and then poof, it's gone. You have a clear winner, Bayraktar, and you have a clear loser, whatever just disappeared. If we bracket off emerging autonomous systems, so UCAVs, the real value of UAVs and RPAs lies not within a kinetic application, but rather the ability to fold this asset into the wider combat structure and provide information, so your intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance duties. While this doesn't provide the same footage as when they fire a missile or drop small explosive charges, this information advantage can be a real asset to small, even platoon-sized groups of soldiers on the ground, to local commanders overseeing a larger area, needing up-to-date information, to potentially operation-level command that require input not just from the traditional channels, but also via visual live feeds. As intelligence and surveillance platforms, these systems provide a lot of use, both in combat and in surveillance roles. As intelligence and surveillance platform, UAVs and RPAs provide a lot of use, both in combat and in surveillance roles. For example, if you are a state with a large, extensive area that you have to police, or you're in need of coin assets, or you need some sort of cheap air presence and you cannot really have a fully fledged air force, then RPAs can be extremely useful. Examples could, for example, be the operations that Saudi Arabia has to fly over their large desert space against the Houthis, or you could look at remote areas in Africa or South America for this sort of long-range surveillance. NATO operations even over the Atlantic, where RPAs are starting to make an appearance. Or of course, the United States maritime anti-smuggling operations, right? A relatively simple long-range system with good enough sensors and command line of sight control is what will fulfill that role at a relatively good price. But beyond that, if you put it into a peer-to-peer adversary conflict, I think we should hold off from declaring RPAs to be a new game changer. They are not. Does this mean that you won't see any more drone strikes? No. They will continue to happen, of course. And if one side has no working air defense, something like Bayraktar will be very effective as a strike platform. Just as much as an old T-54 tank would be a very effective asset, despite its age and despite its limitation, in an environment where the opposing force doesn't have any anti-tank weapons. What do I always say? Context matters. Might as well make that my catchphrase now and put it on a t-shirt if I only had like an ounce of capitalist enterprise in me. But yes, it comes down to this. RPAs are not an end-all be-all. But for peer-to-peer use, in terms of substituting conventionally piloted fixed wings aviation, we will most likely be seeing increasing development in like sort of LO, VLO autonomous systems, which does bring me now, of course, to UCAVs, but that will be covered in another video. So I hope that you all enjoyed this video, and let me know what you thought about it down in the comment section below. Add to it, have a discussion amongst yourselves, what you think about UAVs, RPAs, UCAVs, and so on. Of course, in the description as well, a couple of helpful links. First of all, of course, to the sources of this video, and also a big thank you here to all the patrons and channel members who sustain this channel with their support. If you do enjoy this sort of content that I make, and if you're still watching right now, that would imply that you perhaps do, then do consider checking out Patreon and channel membership subscription options there. You also get a couple of nice perks, like for example, we also have a Discord channel, which is awesome because we regularly meet up there and have discussion amongst ourselves about everything aviation related and other matters as well, which is really awesome. So yeah, thank you very much for watching, everybody. Go out there, be with your friends, be with your family, have a fantastic day, and see you in the sky.